Sadashiva Samarambam Shankaracharya Madhyamam Asmadacharya Paryantam Vande Guru Paramparam Ishvaro Guratmeti Murti Veda Vibhagine Yomabda Vyapta Dehaya Dakshinamurtaye Namaha Sava Vedanta Sedanta Gocharam Tamagocharam Govindam Paramanantam Satguru Pranatosh Maham Om Shanti 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 Om Namaste. Welcome to our class on Vivekachudamani. We begin today from the verse 72. We have been unfolding the verse on, I guess it's on the after having discriminated the self from the five sheets and so on, we are under the top, the self, your essential nature, which began on verse 61. So we are now continuing on the verse 72. So the previous verse, Shankara says that the self, which declares the truth about its nature, he's speaking as the self. He says, I am not in things and beings, but they are in me. So this is a very important statement, Vedantic statement, that distinguished Mithya from Satya, or Satya from Mithya. So everything is not apart from Satya, the self. The self is not in everything, but everything is in the self. So although at times it appears as if the self is in everything, if the self-consciousness existence is a product of the not self, of energy and matter, but no, everything appears within the self, within the scope of the self. So it's the other way around. Everything are in me, but I'm not in any of these things. So the same declaration was presented by Lord Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita. The verse 72, Shankarya continues saying that if the world were real, it would appear in deep sleep. So as we know, the definition of reality is that which is always ever present and not subject to change, modification. So reality is that which is always present and never changes. So something that is beginningless and endless. In fact, time and space come and go within the self. Whenever Maya comes into operation, as we know. So in the only reality is that which is always present, never changing, never ever changing, never modifying, regardless of whatsoever is superimposed upon this light of the self, this conscious awareness, the light of the illuminator, the revealer and the illuminator. So if the world were real, it would appear in deep sleep. So what does that tell us? It tells us that the world is not real because the jiva, the consciousness appearing as the jiva, experienced three states of consciousness. And when we examine these three states, we see that in the waking state, the jiva experiences the world of objects. And then when he goes into the dream state, again, he experiences a different world of objects, okay? It's the mental, the subtle, mental, emotional realm of subtle objects. which is retained as mental impressions in his mind or her mind that somehow projects itself to create this dream world. So in the awakened state, in the dream state, the jiva is there as consciousness, and we see the mind of the jiva, which is not apart from consciousness. These two orders, these two realms, these two worlds appear: the physical material world and the mental emotional world, the impressions uh, in the mind of consciousness. So we have these two states in which consciousness is there and different objects, different worldly objects appear, and we can establish by analysis that consciousness does not change, but these two worlds, they change, they are structured differently. So in the awakened state, the visual experiences the world in a way that everything is solid, it's physical. Time is properly structured in a way that the jiva can somehow work its karmas. The purpose of this entire projection is to provide us with a stage on which we can apparently work our karma, our desires, our goals in life, our fears, our unfinished business, and so on. So we can do that during the waking state. In the dream state, it's not really possible because there isn't much of any structure, because in that world, the objects are made of sat and sat alone. It's just everything is too subtle and too fast and absolutely unstructured in a way that there is no, this paradigm of time and space is not properly designed so that we can go about from one objective experience and another, and having the time to process experience and learn certain lessons from it. So in the dream state, the structure is not there and things happen very fast, and the objects are just sorts of objects. They never grossify to become real object, and we don't have our intellect as well as sharp, as clear. So it's a different state, but we know by following the analysis presented by the Upanishads that there is one principle, one factor with consciousness, which is exactly the same consciousness that somehow experience the awakened state. This consciousness will experience the dream state likewise. Okay. So what happened when we move from the sleeper or the dreamer into the deep, from the awaker and the dreamer, and then into the deep sleeper? When we go into deep sleep, the world disappears. So now we don't have anymore the physical material world that we know in our awakened state, and we don't have even the dream world, which is but a projection from my vasanas, from the mental impressions that were retained. It's just what's left from my interaction with the world, in my awakened state. It leaves those mental impressions that they somehow they cluster together to become vasanas and predispositions and tendencies, and then they project themselves, and then we see this world. So now we are in a situation in the deep sleep that none of those realities are available to us. We don't have the physical and we don't have the subtle world. So we have only one thing there. So this one thing is what? It's the same consciousness that was conscious of what? Of the physical material world, the same consciousness that became conscious of the subtle world, and that is the same consciousness that now is aware of what? Of no world, no physical material and no subtle world. So what is that? That is aware of the absence of both worlds. That is consciousness. And consciousness is said to be the only reality because it's the only factor that is always ever present. So it's present in the presence of object, and it's present in the absence of object. So in the deep sleep, what is the pranya jiva experiencing? The prana jiva is experiencing something very, very unique and pleasant and extremely subtle, which is no duality. That's why it's said to be almost enlightened. That's why it's meant to be called like Anandamaya Kosha, because it's the peace, of non-duality, the peace of absence of the world, of object. So the jiva is experiencing non-duality. The jiva is experiencing the absence of objects. But we know in retrospect that we were there experiencing the world. We know for sure. Why? Why we know that? Because we loved it. And we only love something that we experienced and we enjoyed. We say, oh, no, I want to go back there because it was so peaceful. It was so great. Huh? There was nothing bothering me. This duality, subject, object, was not present. So, what is the degree of reality of the world, the physical material, and the subtle, which are not nothing but impressions left behind from the physical material world in our minds? So, what is the degree of reality of the physical material world and the subtle world if they are not always present? We can easily say that the dream world is not real. Oh no, it's not real. Why? Because it appears only in the dream state. We have no problem to say that. Huh? The dream world, no, it's not real. Why? Because it's not always present. It only appears within one state of consciousness, which is the dreaming consciousness. Now we have to, to stretch that and understand that the same is the case with the waking state. The waking state experiences the world of objects, and then once we analyze our experience, we can see that this reality, this sensory experience of physical material objects, okay, it's not real. Why? Because it changes when I become a sleeper, and it disappears when I become it changes when I become a dreamer, and it disappears when I become a deep sleeper, right? So what is not changing? Consciousness is not changing when it is the waker, the deep sleeper, and the dreamer. But those three objects of experience, they are changing. So we have to go back and explain and understand as well that the absence of object is as well an object. What is an object? Is something that can be known, can be experienced, is something other than myself, and anything other than the self can be revealed, experienced, and known by the self, right? So the absence of the physical, material, and subtle world of objects is an object of experience, experienced by the same consciousness, okay? Although consciousness is not an experiencing entity, but there is nothing that can be known and experienced apart from consciousness, because the mind exists within consciousness, okay? It's a superimposition, is an upadi of the self. So if the world were real, it would appear in deep sleep as well. And as we know, the deep sleep state, both of the worlds disappear. Therefore, this physical material world, we have to somehow reject as reality the same way we reject the dream world, okay? Because it changes, and then it disappears, and then it appears again. And anything that is present now and was not present before and will not be present afterwards cannot be real. Understand? So there is only one reality, and that is consciousness, that in which these three worlds are superimposed. They are superimposed, and they are known, they are experienced, they are witnessed. That which is real does not come and go. It abides in all three states of experience. So what is that which abides through all three states of experience? It's consciousness. The world is a collection of mental impressions producing changing objects perceived by a subject, the jiva. So this is an important statement. The world we experience is nothing but a collection of thoughts. Okay, the object is the same thing as the thought of an object, and we never know what has come first, the thought of object or the object. Okay, but not all of that is just mental thought impressions, okay, which produce changing objects perceived by a subject, the Mr. Jiva, or the Mrs. Jiva, or the Miss Jiva. We experience this subject-object duality when we are awake and when we are dreaming, as I have unfolded. The supposed difference between dream objects and awake objects do not affect the experience of duality. In either case, there is duality. There is a subject experiencing objects, physical, gross objects or subtle objects. There is duality there. In either way, the nature of those two worlds, the two sorts of objects, do not affect the fact that everything here is. Oh, thank you, Dave. You see, this is good. Otherwise, okay, now we can carry on. Now we are G6 again. Hello, Karen. We are hoping we're going to show up.
I'm sorry I'm late.
No problem. We experience this subject-object duality when we are aware and when we are dreaming. The supposed difference between the dream objects and the awakened objects are irrelevant in the sense that, in any case, in either way, it's just duality. Subject, jiva, experience, growths, and subtle objects, okay? Subject-object duality. When we pass into what is called deep sleep, and then there is a change of experience, you know? When we pass into what we call deep sleep, this subject-object experience, this duality, subject-object, is no longer experienced. Although, if we further investigate our experience, we have to admit that there is a sort of duality, because it is this very subtle reach called the prana experience the absence of gross and subtle objects. Okay, but the absence of object, the negation of objects, does not necessarily cancel the fact that that itself is also an object. Why? Because in retrospect, we know that we have experienced the absence of objects, of gross and subtle objects. Okay, so but in a more dense level, the duality subject-object disappears. Yeah? Seems to have disappeared. The world disappears in that condition. So the world cannot be real, yeah, when we analyze from that angle. The world cannot be real. Yet, when the world disappears, we remain as the witness of deep sleep. So there is a witness conscious awareness which allows us, as the prana jiva, in retrospect, when the prana becomes visual, okay, in retrospect, there is consciousness there operating the prana jiva, which allows us, in retrospect, once prana turns to become visual, to understand that I have experienced non-duality, I have experienced the absence of object, okay? We recollect the deep sleep, but we can only describe that negatively. What it means negatively, it's like it's not this, it's not that. There was no gross objects and there were no subtle objects. So we can describe the experience on negative terms. Okay, from the standpoint of what? From the standpoint of the visual in awakened state, we can only analyze in retrospect once once the dreamer, once the sleeper prana turns to become visual. And then as the waker, in retrospect, we can understand, by inference. Okay, we can understand by inference that we have experienced something. Okay, from the standpoint of the awake state, we can know that we have experienced something and we describe this something negatively. How we define something negatively is when we have nothing that we can say about the absence of things. And then we have to relate to the things that are absent in that state. And they say, oh, there were no colors, there were no smell, there were no this, no forms, there was no attribute, there was nothing, there was no duality, there was no unknown, there was nothing. But yet, that is a description of something which is an object of experience to the prana. Okay? Now, one thing may be distinguished from another by noting those qualities it lacks in comparison with one another. Now, it's saying like, so we can't define things negatively. So we define things positively whenever things appear, and they appear as with qualities, properties, and attributes. And then we can compare the attributes and the qualities and the purpose and of each thing, and then we describe them comparatively. Okay. But when we come to the state of deep sleep, so we have to describe it out how? Negatively. It's more or less how we go about with Vedanta, discriminating the self negatively by saying the self is not this, the self is not that, the self is not this, it's not that, it's not this, and not, it's none of this. Okay, so we are right, we don't have much of a description for the self except Satchitananda. It's the existence of all things, it's limitless by nature, and is conscious knowledge, pure knowledge. So we have this description, which is the description of the nature of the self. But once we want to really, define what is the self, we need to define it negatively, because the self is nirguna. And only when the gunas come into place, it can be described for what it is. You understand? It can be described. In the case of deep sleep, the gunas, they are at play. But the deep sleep is a notion of tamas, as in some of our texts they describe. It's a notion of tamas in which there is no reflection. The reflection of the subject and objects are absent there. And that kind of experience, it contains certain gunas by which it is somehow constituted, but it cannot be seen, it cannot be felt, smelled, seen, because there are no reflections in there. You understand? There is no real projections. Nothing is real projection. There is not enough sattva. There is not enough rajas. There is a lot of tamas. Therefore, it cannot be experienced by our sensory instruments. You understand? Like we do in the dream state and awakened state. So there are some gunas in there, but those gunas are not manifesting themselves so that they can be captured by our sensory apparatus, either as a dreamer or a waker, in the case of the deep sleeper. So either the prana does not have those organs properly defined, and neither the experience of absence of objects have enough substance so that it can be captured by any one of those sensory instruments. You understand? But there is some guna in there, of course. So we recollect that deep sleep negatively. But such a negative description tells us little, very little about the nature of the thing in itself. We know we don't experience objects in deep sleep. This is a negative description. Okay? So when we try to describe the self, I'm drawing a parallel here. When we try to describe the self and we go about saying it's not this, it's not that, it's not that, we are trying to describe it in a negative way, but all this, not this, net, they say very little about the self, right? Because the self is not an object defined by the gunas that can be pointed as this and or that. You understand? The self is the subject in which this and that comes, stays, and go. Come, stay, and go. So these negative descriptions tell us little about the nature of the thing in itself. We know we don't experience objects in deep sleep. This is a negative description. We know that a state exists in which objects are absent. That we know. So we know that objects are conditional. So now we are wrapping it up. The objects, they are conditional. They depend on certain condition. They depend on certain states. They depend on the state of the waker, and they depend on the mind of the dreamer. Those two states need to be there for the world to appear. Okay? So the world depends, it enjoys a certain existence, degree of conscious existence, which depends on consciousness itself. They depend upon a particular circumstance for their apparent existence. That which depends upon something else is not self-existent. It's not self-evident. No, it's not self-conscious. It depends on something else. Of course, everything depends on consciousness, and the world, the subtle and the dense, gross world depends on consciousness, because they are not always present. It depends on those two states, which means that it's not really real. The only thing that is present in all the three states of experience is that which witnesses them. So what is present is our very, very, very nature as conscious awareness. So this conscious awareness is present through all these three states. This witness does not change as the states change. So the states change, the worlds change, the objects change, but consciousness does not change. It is unaffected by the presence or absence of objects. Deep sleep is evidence of this abiding witness, which is unchanging consciousness, the self. Deep sleep is also evidence that the world is not real, because the world disappears. Now, we could come back and object these teachings and then say, okay, so but how about when I become a deep sleeper, the world disappears to me. And then people in Australia are going to be awake and the world is going to be appearing to them. So it means to say that the world is real because it is appearing here and there. Because here and there will be some state, some people experience the waking state. You understand? But in Australia, they are going to be experience the environment of Australia. They cannot experience the environment of Italy or Brazil. Why? Because in Italy and Brazil, people are sleeping. But even if people sleep, some people, they do night shift, they are awake, right? So how about that? So is the world always present, or is the world just appearing, disappearing according to our state of consciousness? So in this analysis, the world appears and disappears depending on our state. And it is a fact that this state is all over the place, even in our own country, because some people will be awake in the night doing some sort of a job and so on. But from a wider perspective, you understand, there is a condition in which the world completely disappears. This is referred by the scriptures as prolaya. When prolaya comes, and then which is also referred as the night of Brahman, no? And then the world, meaning to say all jivas, Ishvara, and Jagat, the world, all disappear and go back into its causal, macrocosmic causal formation. So in that case, there is nothing. There is no jiva, there is no Ishvara, and there is no world at all. So, but from the standpoint of the experience of the jiva and its conscious awareness, it is important as teaching because it explains to us that in all these states of consciousness change and the objects change and they even all disappear, but there is one principle that is always present, and this is consciousness. Is this from the micro standpoint as jivas? From the macro, you understand? And then we have to come back and understand the macro teaching that says whenever there is a total dissolution of the universe, the so-called prolaya, and this universe disappears and consciousness remains self-luminous, self-evident as the only reality, you understand? And the world shrinks back to its seed or potential formation. And then when circumstances again are proper, and then it projects itself. So this is, we have to understand it from the standpoint of scriptural knowledge, okay? There is a lot of philosophical discussions around this subject on the Brahma Sutras, which is very nice for anyone who is interested. I want to get more time to get into those discussions, but I have been too busy trying to settle down now in Brazil. Verse 73. The self-consciousness is the substrate of the world. Perception causes objects to appear in consciousness and makes them appear to be separate from it. So as we know, consciousness or the self is all pervasive. It pervades. It's what's the other word? It permeates, pervades, no? Everything in Nietzsche as the substratum of the world. No? Perception, and this is a very, very nice teaching, very subtle. Perception causes objects to appear in consciousness. It's the perception. So first we have the projection. The projection projects just energy. Energy begins vibrating. And then those vibrations become thoughts. And these thoughts, they evolve to become the primary elements, the energy, the three energies and the elements. And then all these creations unfolds with the perceptive organs, because the creation is only complete when whatsoever is projected can be experienced and known in consciousness. So we need perception. So perception causes the objects to appear in consciousness. Wow. So it means to say that the objects, they only appear in consciousness because of perception. Huh? So it means to say, if it was not for our perceptive organs, which is a development from the primary subtle elements, or the three energies, the qualities, and then the basic elements, and then we have the formation of these elements, and then immediately the perception, so that it can capture the creations, and the experiencer, the knower, requires these perceptive organs. So perception seems to be the cause of the world, because without perception there is no world. The world is there, but it does not really appear in consciousness, So it means to say that all of this is soaked in consciousness. And because we perceive through our sensory apparatus, we feel, we sense, we have the impression that it exists apart from consciousness, that exists outside of our minds. But in fact, it is soaked in consciousness instead, and it appears in consciousness and not apart from consciousness. But due to the structure of our perceptive organs, it appears as if projected outside of our minds, understand? Outside of consciousness. So the self is the substrate of the world. Perception causes the world of objects to appear in consciousness and makes us believe that they are apart from consciousness. So again, we need to remember the consciousness is all pervasive. Consciousness is like space. Everything exists in consciousness the same way that all gross objects exist within space. There is nothing apart from space and there is nothing apart from consciousness. Consciousness is the substratum, okay? So there is nothing apart, but perception makes it appear as project outside of our minds. We take the mind to be consciousness, and then we say the objects appear outside of my consciousness, therefore reality is duality. So my consciousness is reality, and the objects that appear outside of consciousness is duality. This is all due to this structure called perception, the organs and the instruments of perception that makes the object appear apart from us. If it was not from that, for that, so there will be no experience, there will be no duality, there will be no world. The world appears in the mind of the jiva through these perceptive organs, you know. I know that the birds chirping outside the window and the children playing on the streets are not me. I seem to exist as a separate entity, so I see anything outside there and I say, yeah, I am what I am, and that is what it is. The world is what it is, a variety of independently existing objects, and we miss to understand and to hold that, understand that everything is just happening within myself. We see myself as consciousness, of course, huh? That which pervades everything. Yet the verse tells me that this perception is false. The perception, the objects are out there, independent, separate, and they have independent existence on their own and so on. The verse tells us that perception, this perception is not correct, it's false, that the self is the substrate of all these seemingly distinct objects. In other words, everything is consciousness appearing with this variety of objects, which are nothing but superimposition on the screen of consciousness. So the self is the substrate of all these seemingly distinct projections of objects. This distinction between Satya, and now, now the next verse goes to say that the distinction between Satya and Mithya, the only reality in this projection of this apparent reality must be understood clearly if confusion is to be avoided. The text cannot mean that there is no difference between the birds and the trees or the children in the street, meaning to say that the objects, they are part of this secondary order of reality, which is but a superimposition on awareness, okay? So all of these names and forms, they appear like independent from one another, and guess what? They are diversity, they are plurality, they are different, you know, numberless, you know, infinite numbers, numberless, infinite numbers of names and forms. It's not that they are all the same, that the children, the bird, and myself, we are all one in that sense. You understand? So there is distinction. In Mithya, plurality is the law. In Mithya, duality, diversity is law. Okay, but what the Upanishad says is that that the essential nature of everything is one and the same. Everything is just a superimposition in consciousness, projection consciousness. Therefore, everything is but consciousness superimposed by certain names and forms. Names and forms are nothing but constitutions of the three energies and the elements, given names and properties by the mind, by the intellect of the jiva. The jiva tells, you know, is going to interpret and determine the objects according to its properties and purpose and functions and and attributes. It's the jiva that develops that understanding and projects value to the object. The test cannot mean that there is no difference between all of these objects in creation. These objects, they exist in this ocean of plurality of names, colors, and forms. What the Upanishad says is that they are not separate from consciousness. So this is a very important understanding. Okay, all this duality, all this plurality, all this diversity of names and forms and colors, they do exist in this apparent projection, in this apparent superimposition, this order reality called mithya. Okay? But what the Upanishad says is that they all occur, they all happen in consciousness and not apart from consciousness. And fundamentally, consciousness as consciousness, because all there is consciousness, in the same way that all ornaments of gold are but gold, but we superimpose numberless shapes, forms, names for all these different ornaments of gold. And then gold appears as what? Appears as like when you go in one of those gold shops. No, in the West we see that infinity of different ornaments of gold. So now gold appears like wow, it is it's a universe of names and form, but the essential nature, the only reality, the substantial nature of all of that is only gold. So the same way, all of these diversities and of the pluralistic world of objects, it's just a superimposition consciousness. Consciousness is the substantial nature of everything there is. And it's brought about by Mr. Maya, using the three basic qualities, which develops the elements, and then it start combining to produce this infinity of different constitutions called names and forms. So all of that is made by consciousness, is maintained by consciousness, and exists in consciousness and not apart from consciousness. The same way all ornaments of gold exist in the gold. The gold do not exist in them. Them exist in the gold. The gold do not exist in the ornaments. The ornaments exist in gold because gold is the substantial, essential nature of everything made out of gold. So the same principle. They are not separate from gold the same way that all these objects that we experience, they are not separate from consciousness, the essential nature of everything. So let's return to the clay and the pot. So Vedanta is, after all, very simple. It's subtle, but it's very simple. Our examples, our metaphors, our analogies are what they are. We can jump from the gold, we can jump from the clay, to the ocean, and so on. Now we go here and say, let's go to the clay and the pot of clay, made of clay. Clay can be fashioned into many objects besides a pot. So we have a pot, we have a bowl, a pitcher, a plate, a vase, so anything. All of these objects are different, yet everything is but clay. So we have no doubt about that. What is the reality of all objects of clay? Which is the essential substantial nature of every object, which is clay. No? So it's all clay. That which inheres in all the forms, that which is the substratum, the substantial essence, is the clay. We can look at these objects of clay, however, from the vantage point of their difference or the sameness. This is very nice. We can look at every object of the clay from the angle, from the perspective of their difference, which is a superimposition of clay, or by their sameness. They are the same, how? As their essential, substantial nature, okay? The substantial nature of all those objects of clay is clay. So we are looking into the essential nature. We're looking at it from the angle of the sameness of all objects of clay. Now we're going to look from a utilitarian, practical angle, and we're going to look from their difference. The difference are what? Are superficial. Difference are superficial. Superficially, I know this is a cup, and I need a cup, and I need a plate to eat. So don't tell me that this is a clay, because now I need to extract the utilitarian value of this name, this shape of clay, this form of clay, this name and form of clay. Don't come with this philosophy, because now I need to eat, and I don't like to eat with my hands. I need a plate, right? And then when we look from the difference, from the names and forms, and then we say, okay, no, this is a plate, and I enjoy it as a plate, and I need it as a plate. So that needs to be understood. When we look at their difference, we are looking at media. When we look at the clay, as the sameness of clay with a particular shape and name, that will last in its current form for a period of time. No, I jumped. When we are looking at media, when we look at their different shapes and names, the apparent reality, clay with a particular shape and name that will last in its current form for a period of time. We know that every name and form is bound by time, right? So we never heard of a plate of clay or any material, even plastic, that is very hard to be destroyed, Plastic is difficult to be undone. That's the problem. One of the environmental problems we have nowadays. But even plastic is going to fade, it's going to cripple, it's going to disintegrate one day. So we have no name and form that will last. But we have the substantial nature of all those shapes that remains, because once we drop our clay plate and it just breaks into many pieces on the floor, the clay plate has been destroyed, but the clay is still intact. Are we there? The clay is still intact. So if we know how to put it together and then heat it up, and then again, we could shape something out of that broken piece of clay. When we look at their sameness, their essential substantial nature, we are looking at Satya, the reality behind all names and forms of clay. This clay, as the abiding substratum of the shapes and names it assumes for a time, so that is said to be Satya, that which remains even when names and forms break down. Okay, so names and form, they break down. The essential nature of names and form, which is consciousness, by which it was created, maintained, and recycled, this consciousness remains intact the same way space remains intact, the same way gold remains intact, and the clay remains intact, with the coming together of these names and forms and the destruction of these names and forms. all the objects we perceive have the dual aspect as such in mithya. And that includes what? That includes ourselves as jivas. Hmm? We need to understand, oh, my nature is satya and my nature is mithya. Huh? So as satya, I know that I'm free, I'm whole, and I'm complete. Nothing can really affect me. Huh? But as a jiva, so I know, as a jiva, I am limited, and I need to secure, I need to, to have a roof, protect me against rain and sun. I need food, I need to sleep and so on. So we need to look at the standpoint of the jiva. We have this dual nature, the appearing nature and our primary absolute nature as satya. Satya is consciousness, the self. Mithya are the names and forms that appear in consciousness, and that includes what? Our body-mind complex. Okay? So I have jumped and I put our body-mind complex within the objects that appear within the scope of our conscious awareness. Okay? So the body-mind is in there as well. All objects are perceived. They have a dual aspect as satya and mithya. Satya is consciousness, mithya are the forms that appear in consciousness and to which we assign a particular name. The world then is consciousness plus names and forms. But names and forms have no reality in themselves. So the world then is consciousness, with this superimposition of names and forms. Okay, so we have names and forms, which is a projection made by Maheshwara, in which all the jivas come into place, all the inert objects come into place. We have that, and that occurs in consciousness, and the world of objects is nothing but consciousness plus Maya, which brings about the projection of names and forms. Consciousness plus names and forms brings what we call the cosmos, the world, the universe of objects, of subtle, living objects and inert objects. But the names and forms have no reality in themselves. So the reality of these projections depend on what? Depends on the screen of consciousness, the screen of existence. This existence is going to somehow lend existence, so to speak, lend consciousness to the sentient beings. It's all given by consciousness. Consciousness is the only reality, and the world has no reality on their own. They appear to be consciousness, and they appear in consciousness and are nothing other than consciousness, just as the pot is nothing other than the clay. All objects appear in consciousness and they are nothing other than consciousness, because the essential nature of every object is consciousness. Okay? Just as the pot is nothing other than the clay from which it is fashioned and which it always remains. Whenever we perceive objects, whenever we perceive these names and forms of clay as real, whenever we perceive the objects as real, as separate from consciousness, as independent from consciousness, okay, we are mistaking mithya for satya. Okay, we are superimpose mithya in satya. You understand? Whenever we perceive objects as separate from consciousness, we are mistaking mithya for satya. Whenever we perceive all the names and forms, and all the ornaments, all the objects of clay, made out of clay, whenever we take them to be separate and having an independent existence from the clay, we are confusing satya with mithya, okay? Two orders of reality. One is superimposed by names and forms against or on the other, the other reality, meaning to say satya, which is the substantial nature of everything, okay? That appearing as names and forms. So this confusion between satya and mithya needs to be properly understood, so that again and again we don't do that. Our trouble is this mutual superimposition of satya and mithya and satya. And this, of course, very, very naturally too in our lives. The aim of Vedanta is to prevent this mistake through the unfolding of the great saints of the Upanishads. So Vedanta, essentially, the essence of Vedanta are the Mahavakyas, those famous Mahavakyas, the statements, the declarations of the Upanishads, yeah? The declarations in regards to Satya and Mithya and the substantial nature of Mithya as Satya when it says that you, Jiva Atma, is Paramatma. No? The aim of Vedanta is to prevent this mistake through the unfolding of the great sayings of the Upanishads. In the case of this text, you are that. You are that is the most famous Mahavakya, the most famous declaration of the Upanishads mantra, and which means to say you, the Jiva, is that Brahman. You are the substratum. You are consciousness. You are the substantial nature of this universe, although you appear as the Jiva Atma, you are Paramatma. The individual and the substratum are one. The individual, in its very nature, is the same substratum of the entire universe. Is in its substratum, in its essence, it is conscious existence, it is Brahman. Okay, and Brahman is going to pervade the universe, but in the absence of the universe, Brahman remains yet whole, full, and complete in the absence of the universe. So, anything else? Mark? Anybody has any contribution? Anything to say or any doubt? Any objection?
It's almost too vast to comprehend.
Is almost what?
Too vast. It's just huge, vast.
Oh,
you know?
But
you know, you put it in words, and it's just, you know, it blows your mind. I'll put it that way.
Does anybody feel that way? Does everybody feel that way?
No, I understand it on an intellectual level, but to actually grasp it is, and to live it on a moment-to-moment level is difficult.
Yeah.
But to understand it is one thing.
Yeah, yeah, but
to live completely non-dualistically.
Yeah, self-knowledge begins with this intellectual understanding, and then this intellectual understanding, it somehow it is gradually converted, you know, into a certainty in respect to the nature of Satya and Mithya, and how they are not opposite to one another. They are not like contradictory to one another. You know, you understand that you are the substratum, you are the principle, this factor that pervades everything, and this shift of identity from the name and form of your existence, you know, the attributes of your jiva, you know, the body-mind complex, the identity as the body-mind complex and its constitution and attributes and property, it shifts gradually And then once it becomes firm, established as the substratum, as this ocean of consciousness, as this space of consciousness, and then it remains firm. That's what we call a hard and fast knowledge. When this knowledge is firm, and then even if Maya again and again projects the object outside there, you understand? You are somehow immune against that play, in the sense that you don't go crazy about the objects as if they are real first, and as if they are really filled with self-value. You know that this is all a projection, is all part of this meteor order of reality. Therefore, you can transact in meteor without falling for it, so to speak. Falling, meaning to say, oh, it's real, it's out there, and I go and get it, or I'm gonna do this and that. So this is part of nididhyasana. It's a gradual assimilation of this knowledge until it grows to become fact. Becomes properly integrated in our lives. You understand, Mark?
I do understand, yes.
Yeah, not the objects are going to disappear. They continue to appear, but you don't fall for them as before anymore. You understand? And then you if you need, you can remember the knowledge, you can remember Vedanta. But Vedanta is not something that we have to carry around remembering, opening our books all the time. Once this knowledge is properly integrated or digested and internalized, and then it produces its effect. It's the yana pala, the result of this yana, properly integrate or internalize, is that the objects are not really shining as before. You don't believe in them as before, and then you can transform the world without this being fooled by Maya again and again to believe that the world is real and the objects have real value and so on. So this is something that grows, and it begins with this intellectual understanding, that needs to grow, to be converted, into this equanimity in reference to the world, this resistance or this ability to understand and to interact with the world without really falling for it, like, oh, no, I'm not going to go there. I know that none of this is really real. So this is something that grows spontaneously and gradually. That's what makes Vedanta not a philosophy, but a body of knowledge that brings about transformation in the emotional, mental, intellectual personality of the jiva. You understand? It needs to transform us. That's why I brought up this question. Otherwise, it seems to be just a philosophy.
I agree. It's huge. I agree with Ruth. It seems to me like it's probably the biggest thing for me in Vedanta to grasp.
The world is what's huge. The diversity, the complexity, the awesomeness.
Yeah.
That's what I mean when I say it blows my mind.
Yeah. And now I understood better your statement. Thank you. Yeah. So the world is really, really tricky, and it's deceiving because it's so beautiful. I mean, Ramji says it's beautiful, intelligence, ignorance. It's ignorance because it's not real. You understand? But it appears and it attracts us, and we fall for it, and we just take it to be real. Okay, and only this gradual shift of identity from the body mind to consciousness, which is a simple thing, we can understand it intellectually. But as long as we take ourselves to be the body mind, we're going to see reality as duality. We're going to see the world of objects appearing outside, and we're going to take it to be real, until all these different teachings from different angles, until it brings about a certainty in regard, a hard and fast self-knowledge, certainty of conviction in respect to I am consciousness and everything is consciousness, the substratum of this apparent order reality, which is but superimposition or projection by Maya Shwara. So until that is really a doubtless understanding, knowledge, we will remain like subject and find like, oh my God, this is an impossible mission. We're never going to shift to understand that I am consciousness. But guess what, Karen? Whether we shift our sense of identity, we are consciousness. You are consciousness. Everything is consciousness. It's only that we are so firmly, attached or identified with the body mind as the body mind. And this identification is what immediately brings about the world of objects as real and outside of myself. You understand? Because from my body mind, from my body, there is a distance between me and you. There is a difference of shape. You understand? You are there in the USA, I'm here in Brazil. So there is distance. The time and space is a reality once we really take the body mind to be our true self. The moment that through all these expositions of these teachings, we really understand clearly that we are the consciousness that which illumines and enlivens the intellect of the body mind, and then through the pranas and so on, is going to animate this body to make it alive. So we need to gradually shift our understanding about ourselves until we understand that we are not the mind, we are not our intellectual notion, we are the light that shines in this intellect and vivifies this body-mind complex, you understand? So it's just a question of identification. If we are misidentified with the body as the body, these teachings, they just appear to be absolutely absurd. You understand? Because of this firm identification with the body and with the mind as the body-mind. The purpose of Vedanta is to shift this identification, and it has to begin from a clear intellectual understanding of all these different logics presented by Vedanta, until this grows in certainty, in conviction, in understanding. And then when we least expect it, becomes clear. I mean, Ramji likes to put it as the final click, because when the last doubt is removed, and then like, oh, now I got it. I am the light of consciousness. I'm not the thought that appears in my conscious awareness. The thought that appears in my conscious awareness, I, Karen. I, Karen. No, I'm not the thought, I, Karen. I am the light in which the thought, I, Karen, come and go, disappears. When this thought, I, Karen, disappears in deep sleep, where is I, Karen? There is no Karen. There is only consciousness. You understand? Consciousness is there. This I, Karen, appears mostly in the waking state, and that's the purpose of these teachings. In the waking state, El Karen seems to be I, Karen, seems to be a reality, and it appears that the world is experienced through I, Karen, and that I am the center of the universe, because the whole world, can be experienced through this I, Karen thought. But when this I, Karen thought disappears in deep sleep, so consciousness is there. How you know that consciousness does not go anywhere? Because
Yeah, I guess because you come back in the morning.
yeah, you come back in the morning. If you would have left the body, and then the body would be ready to be disposed in the morning. But no, you were there. Your conscious existence is there. The I thought, the I Karen thought was suspended, but your nature, your true nature as consciousness remains there, witnessing the absence of duality, the absence of the Jiva Karen and the world as experienced by Jiva Karen. You understand? So it appears to be abstract only due to our firm identification with the body mind as the body mind. And the purpose of Vedanta is to loosen up this this misconception until our sense of identity can shift from the body mind to consciousness, pure consciousness. You understand? So Maya is tough. Maya is the greatest trickster, the greatest illusionist. You know, it projects these names and forms. It appears within our minds, and then we take everything to be real, and we miss the only reality, which is the light in which this world, the dream world and the awakened world and the deep sleep world, they are seen, they are known, they experience, they are revealed in the light of consciousness. The only we miss that, and we take the not self as the self, and we miss the self. You understand? So we need to go again and again back to these teachings until we stop missing the most obvious, that which shine in the I thought, producing this I caring thought again and again. So it's not that abstract. It's just that Maya, you know, is a tough kind of a tough force to be defeated, you know. This ignorance is tough to be deceived, defeated, to be destroyed, you know, to be removed. And it's a fact. It's very, very persistent, but it can be destroyed. And there is no other way but by jnana, by knowledge, by understanding of our true nature as consciousness. And we have to go back and back. Okay, I'm not convinced. I am still quite sure that I am the intellect and the body mind, but I don't give up. Right, Dave? I don't give up. And then what I go back to the Upanishads. I go back to the scriptures because, you know, I understood the only freedom possible is by understanding my nature as that which is always free, that which is not affected by experience. Because the body mind is affected by experience and waste the entire life trying to control one's experience so that it can enjoy itself. So the only freedom there is to understand your true nature. Once we understand that, we become obsessed with Vedanta. You know, we see the value, we see that it's possible, we develop shraddha, trust, confidence in this teaching methodology, in the tradition, and then we go back. We are not going to give up so easily, understand? Because we know it's possible. It's the only way we can be free.
I think what you're saying to me is it gets to the word where you are accepting. And so I try and I think I intellectualize a lot, and I try and question and I inquire and I try and understand and all that kind of thing. But eventually, it's going to come down to acceptance, and just for me to accept, the teaching as it is that you talked about, and where my shraddha becomes less and less about inquiry and just more and more about acceptance.
Yeah. So this word acceptance is a good word, but the blind acceptance does not work. Intellectual has to be fully satisfied. Some intellects are more like doughty intellects, and then they have to really go through a lot of reflection, contemplation, and resolution of doubts, questions. You understand? Because some intellects are very complex, and they are going to fight. They are not really going to take so easily this analysis of experience presented by Vedanta. They say yes, but, yes, but, yes, but. And then this kind of intellect needs really a good teacher, because the teacher has to go there and again fight with those buts, but this, but this, but that. You understand? And it has to be done logically, not by any kind of authoritative power and say, oh, you have to accept and believe that. No, the intellect, that's why Vedanta encourages us to bring our questions, our doubts, like Claudio, if he has some doubts that are persistent, and I tell him, bring it up until until it's completely gone. You understand? And it's completely gone only when the intellect is fully satisfied. Some intellects are simpler, and some intellects are more complex. One time someone mentioned to me and said to me like this, but I don't understand. And the guy was a very intellectual guy. It was in the very beginning when I met Ramji. I went to meet with Ramji. This guy was there. And then we went to sleep in his house in Portland. And then he said, but one thing I don't like about Vedanta, it's why it has to be so complex, you know. And he was one in satsang, and every satsang bringing the most complex and philosophical questions that you can imagine, you know. And then he comes to me and says, but why it needs to be so complex, you know? Why it has to be so complex like that? And then I told him, because your intellect is complex, you know, your doubts are very complex. Your resistance, you know, are complex, are intelligent. You understand? So now Vedanta has to come with a lot of complexity so that it can offset the complexity objection, the complex objections and doubts of certain intellects. So the Brahma Sutras are nothing but a lot of food for all these complex intellects that are still yes, but, yes, but, yes, but, yes, but, and then we have a lot of food for that. Okay. So why is Vedanta so complex? Because ignorance is beautiful, intelligent, and complex. It can be so complex that no Vedanta teaching can really resolve such a complexity sometimes, you know? The guy said, no. I'm done with it, and I'm going to hold my doubts, my objections. I don't agree. To me, reality is duality, and so on. And there we go. Okay? And it's okay if we take reality, if we take the world to be real, the objects to be real, we can just make peace with it and say, this is the truth for me, the objects, the world is real, and so on. And then what Vedanta is going to say, that's all right. But please know, understand. Excuse me just for a minute. Just kill it because now I put on airplane mode. Well, take it away. Why you have to keep it here? So going back to the complexity, the beautiful, intelligent, and complex avidya, ignorance, that is Maya. You understand? And we are fed by ignorance. We are born out of ignorance. We are kept in our culture, environmental ignorance. It feeds us with ignorance, and then it becomes so complex, depend on the nature of our intellects, you know. And then we need all these teachings to somehow to offset all this complexity. So going back to what David said, it's acceptance, but acceptance it's an intellectual acceptance, and the intellect has to be absolute. I mean, this self-knowledge begins with an intellectual understanding. It should never stop there, because it has to be gradually converted. When the intellect is fully satisfied, still, you know, there will be still something that preventing the individual from fully appreciate and enjoy its nature as freedom, as conscious, free and independent awareness. You understand? So, and that last click, that last, you know, blessing is even not in the hands of the individual Jiva, but it begins with an intellect that is fully satisfied, you know, an intellect that understood that only by knowledge, understanding, one may be able to enjoy one's experience here in Micha as a human being. No? All right, Karen?
Yes, just I'll just keep working at it to
Yeah.
grasp.
What
Yeah.
else? This is the best game in town. What else should do in life? I mean, we understood that we cannot be happy by trying to control the field of objects and trying to attract only the good things, you know? We know that's impossible. So it's better we dedicate what's left out of our lives to become wiser, because the wiser we become, happier, more we enjoy our human experience here, right? So this is the best game in town, and we are lovers of knowledge. We got here because we love knowledge. This is a tough knowledge, although it's very simple and self-evident. But due to this hardwired ignorance of video, which is this misidentification as the body mind, it becomes a little bit more difficult to be uprooted. But yet we can feel that as this identification, this misidentification loosens up, we begin feeling more and more this sense of freedom, you know, which is inherent to our nature as consciousness, because consciousness is free, it's independent, it does not depend on anything, you understand? It's not bound by time, it's always ever present. It's that which pervades everything. It's the ocean of existence. I exist as consciousness, and consciousness is my very nature, is my very existence. So once this is firmly seen and understood, and then life takes a different flavor to itself. You know, I mean, we begin relating life from a different angle. Okay, and all of this is possible by jnana, by understanding our true nature. Anything else, Mark?
I'm thinking that I can't come up with any questions or arguments against Vedanta, because the logic just holds so true. Once you listen to all the teachings, you can't really argue against it, because it's so obviously the truth.
Yeah.
This is why I don't come up with many questions. I just keep listening to it, keep going through the satsangs and listen to different teachers and read the scriptures, and it all just comes together. And there's nothing really that I can argue against it. And yeah. I don't actually feel that it's that complicated. I think it's vast, but it's quite simple to grasp the concepts of it, really, yeah. I feel.
It's very simple. Vedanta is very simple, but it's very subtle, and that makes it not necessarily easy, you know? But it's very simple.
Yeah, no, it's not easy.
But the teachings are more or less the same, you know? I mean, you just have to digesting that and accepting, to use the word presented by David. It means to say processing it and internalizing it, you know, is the difficult part. Mm. But the teaching is simple, but due to the subtlety of this discrimination, the subtlety of our nature's consciousness is what makes self-knowledge difficult, because our nature as thought, our nature as the knowledge, intellectual, our mental program, you know, it's subtle, but it's tangible in some way, you know. So it's easier for us to disconnect or disidentify from the body and identify with our intellectual notions, philosophical notions, and live from that standpoint. A lot of people live. Some people, they don't care to die, but they prefer to die, but they hold on to their intellectual notions, you know. These people are brave people. They are totally identified with their intellectual beliefs, you know, and they are able even to die for that. So because the intellect and its concepts and notions and one's identity around our intellectual understandings, our intellectual notions, It's something subtle, but consciousness is the subtlest of the subtle, as the scripture says. So what makes it difficult for us to embrace our nature as consciousness is because consciousness is nirguna. It does not have anything for us to say, okay, I understood, I am this. No, you are not this. Because if you say I am this, you'll be sure it's not this. You understand? So the subtlety of our nature's consciousness is what makes it easier for us to embrace it because we want something tangible to say that I am. Understand? And there is nothing that will define except Satchitananda, existence, consciousness, and limitlessness. We'll say, oh my God, but this is so subtle. Existence, what is existence? Consciousness, what's consciousness? Once Vedanta tells me that the mind is not consciousness, the intellect is not consciousness, they are just thoughts. Okay. So consciousness, existence, and limitlessness, this is to solve. How can I define myself like that? You understand? So that's the difficult, which embracing it. So, and then what it takes a mind that becomes very subtle in order to discriminate the consciousness itself from the intellect, from the mind, and claim its identity as consciousness. The intellect has to be very subtle to be able to define and to discriminate, separate consciousness from the mind and claim one's identity. So it's a subtle intellect. That's why there is so much emphasis in the process of purification and refining and purifying the intellect until it becomes very subtle, very sattvic. You understand? So due to the subtlety of consciousness, which can never be defined as this or that, but it's clearly known as what? As the knower. And the knower is not the mind. The knower is the light that enlivens the mind. You see, it boils down to this discrimination between consciousness and the intellect. Consciousness and the very subtle intellect, it has to be seen as different, as distinct factors until we can understand that nothing is really apart from this conscious existence. But it needs to be seen as distinct, as dualities, satya and mithya. So our nature is very subtle, and that's why it makes it a little bit difficult to claim our identity as something that's so subtle, But that's the game. That's why we get together again and again. And it's fun. Isn't it fun, Claudio? Huh?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah, I find it's very, I was thinking exactly that it is very fun for me. I have an intellect that needs real clarity, and but it's fun for me also because thinking, contemplating all this, and then of course I think it's also to develop the qualifications, to be dispassionate towards object, because I really understand. Of course, I understand it better when we are in the class because I forget it in the daily, in life. So I have to remind of this. But I see clearly that I'm always present. I cannot avoid to experience the world, and that means that there is always a subject, So I cannot avoid it. That means that I'm always present. But I caught, how you say, I'm not too much dispassionate with the objects. I
Yeah.
don't know if it's clear. I'm,
Yeah.
you know, sometimes the objects are, you bring value to too much value to the objects
Yeah.
so often. So
Yeah, because Maya makes us still believe that objects are real, you know, again and again,
yeah,
and then again
yeah,
and again we have
exactly. It's very hard, you know, you see
we have to go
ignorance
through
that is so hard.
we have to go through these teachings again and again. That's why I have been talking like until these teachings they become alive in our minds. They are so alive in our mind that it somehow it offsets the power of Maya, you know. Say, no, go and get it. It's real. This is yummy and this and that, you know, and that. And you know, when we see we are trying to play with Mitya as a mean to, you know, to find freedom, happiness. Yeah. Very nice. Okie dokie. So I'm glad we had this verse 73 taking care. We begin from the identity and you and that, which is going to go even deeper into the subtle realms, the deep water, the subtle realms of Vedanta. Okay, so we meet again Thursday with some questions, if there are questions. Otherwise, we can make them up in the moment. And so you guys enjoy your day, your week, and Ishwara willing, we meet again this coming Thursday. Okay? Om Purnamada Purnamidam Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnamevavashishate Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Thank you, Lord. Thank you all. And namaste. Bye, Ruth.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye, Karen.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, 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 bye.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks, thanks.